So, we're going to pose a question for you, and let's have a conversation. I'll try to write some notes up here on the board. And the question is, what kinds of changes are affecting your context for ministry? I'm assuming for most of you that means a congregation, but what kind of changes do you see going on that are affecting your context for ministry?
Differences for the folks in the pews. You've got some that don't use any technology, and you've got others who are sitting with their cell phones in their hands, pumping everything out during worship. So that broad spectrum.
I said aging, and I don't really think boomers are doing that very well. It's very hard for people to let go of anything, and therefore very hard for them to start something new.
In a way, this is tied in with aging, but it's complacency. I see that in our church, it's so easy to feel comfortable, to kind of rest on the laurels of where this long-term congregation, over 100 years old, has been, and to rest in their laurels and just not have a lot of energy now to change, and to be content, and for them not to realize that we have really become such an aging and weakened congregation that we need to make some changes to survive.
This is tied into that as well, but there's a significant change in volunteers and what volunteers are willing to do and how they're willing to do it as the next generation is coming into what we would anticipate be the leadership roles in the church to replace the oldest generation. They don't have the same level of commitment to volunteer work in anything. It's not just the church, but across the spectrum.
We are in a world where we are living with the seekers, not the joiners, and it's really hard for us to understand that. The seekers are looking for something that's going to make a difference, and joining doesn't make a difference to them. So they're not going to be Presbyterian just because somebody in their family has been Presbyterian forever. They're not even going to choose a particular church. They'll be there for a while, and then they'll be somewhere else for a while. Whoever's doing something that makes them feel like they are making a difference. So.
And let me check with you to see if this makes sense. The generational changes are one factor with volunteers, but another factor is what's happened in our economy, right? And if there are two parents or two adults in a household, because of changes in the cost of real estate and standard living, cost of living, all that stuff, people don't have as much disposable time. Does that make sense to you?
I was fortunate enough to have my 32-year-old son come and help me move last month. And we actually got to the coast a couple of times, which I lived in Monmouth at the time, so that meant a lot of hostage car time. But he was really... Well, that's a good question, because we tend to argue even when we agree on things. But we had a lengthy conversation about volunteerism, and he does a lot of complaining about how the world is, and it's a good critique of that. He has a good critique of it. But I finally said, so what are you doing about it? I said, here's what I do. I go to town meetings, and I go visited the chief of police in one town, and I said, so what are you doing? He said, well, And, so I said, basically, it's bleeper, get off the pot. But what he thinks about volunteerism is that he's somebody who graduated from college right at the downturn of the economy. He said people are just getting work for free. They're just trying to raise money and things like that for their organizations, and they just want us to work for free. So, yes, he will work for an organization that furthers something in his area, perhaps, but there's this sense economically that it's not right for churches and other groups, nonprofits, to use volunteers. So that's a little bit different than anything I had heard lately, except I've certainly talked about churches hiring people part-time so they don't have to pay benefits and that kind of thing, but this was a real antipathy towards volunteerism.
There's a lot of talk about the Gen Xers and younger and their approach to volunteerism or any activism. I really wasn't talking about that. I'm going to be quite, and this may offend some of you, but the fact of the matter is we are the greedy generation that raised that generation and those behind us. And what I'm seeing, I serve a church that's on the coast in a retirement community. And the people I'm talking about are the ones my age or just a bit older who are retiring now, not the young ones. I'm talking about the ones who have plenty of time but are very, very protective of it and refuse at this point in their lives to commit to those things which take long-term work. And that is, we could bridge to the younger generation, but it's those in the center that we are missing as real workers.
This may be off base a little bit because we're talking congregations here, but the thing that seems to be happening right now, a few days ago, is the emboldening of white supremacy and some of those folks who are trying to fulfill our administration's promise of taking back America. And that's something that I think somewhere down the line we might discuss at the congregation level and at Presbytery level. It's a transformation that we...
The hard polarization, political polarization in the church. And then a second is that the big context that we work in is that generations following us means test things. The church isn't necessarily good. The church is only good if it has shown itself to be good. And that's a different context than I grew up in. And so my children say, the church hasn't done anything, or what has it done? And they would be happy to help and to volunteer and to be a part of it, but there's no evidence that we have been of any value.
So I would kind of add to that in terms of the fact that we live in the Pacific Northwest, which is well known to be the none zone, where people would rather check the box none when it comes to religious affiliation. And with the events of Charlottesville, one of the things I clicked on was the Southern Poverty Law Center's map of hate groups, and there are 11 in Oregon. And one of them is in Clackamas, and it's called the National Prayer Network. So I think, if you are someone who has no idea of what the church is or churches because you weren't raised in it, how are you going to trust the church when they are known as a hate group I think we're being hijacked in a way.
You have a loud voice. You don't have to have anything.
And on this conversation, I grew up in Dallas, and I've lived in the South since 1999, and I lived in Chicago for 15 years, so I've seen different regions of our country. And growing up in Dallas, it was very white, and I had no direct experience of people of other colors except at a distance. And it wasn't until I started teaching at an African American seminary that when I came home for a visit, was down at the local newspaper talking to a young reporter who said she had been going through old files of the Dallas paper and had found a photograph in one of the issues from 1925 of the July 4th parade going down Main Street. I know right where that is. And on one of the wagons, one of the big trucks on the flatbeds, was a bunch of people in white robes. And well, this is where I'm going with this point. And the banner on the truck said, "A Bible in every classroom." Yeah, it kind of blew me back a little bit. So part of what I'm getting at here to pick up on some of this conversation about polarization and race and difference and diversity and all that stuff, is here I grew up in this town that had these secrets, and I didn't know anything about them. And here, I grew up during the 60s, and all of this stuff about social unrest, political struggle, equal rights, civil rights, was all from the television. And I didn't realize that that was reflected in the world that I grew up in, only in a much more, shall we say, clandestine way at that point.
Oregon, until not too long ago, Oregon had in its constitution that black people may never live here. So it's been a long, long time that we've had, that it wasn't enforced after a while. A lot of towns had sunset laws, though. If you're black, you're out of town before sunset. The whole not living here is, if you were found living here, you would be flogged once a year until you decided to leave. That law was only 45 years. Right.
So, is this a fair statement then, to summarize in talking about this, that part of what's changing is in our public common arena, this kind of stuff is being brought more to light and talked about, even if we often don't agree on whether it's real or whether something should be done, that the polarization is real, and part of the reason the polarization is real is because the stuff is starting to get out there in what I call the public arena.
We had polarization in this congregation where I'm retired, but I've been worshiping here for 10 years at least. And the latest one was about the ordination of gay people, where the whole, and this, Eugene is a very gay-friendly town, but we have the whole spread of liberal and conservative in any congregation, pretty much. And, and so when we hired an associate, the session hired a temporary associate gay person, and people left the church. They came back once that person went away. And I was serving on COM at that time, and it just pained me so much when we had congregations leave the Presbytery over the ordination of gay people. And it's like, it was because we finally started talking about it, I guess, and addressing the issue. But Anyway, that has been a hard thing, and people weren't dealing with it theologically. So one of the coolest things that happened is after all this brouhaha, the most conservative biblical scholar in the congregation and I led a Bible study where we went through all the texts and talked about, how they could be interpreted each way. And God really does love gay people, and it's okay. That was my thing. But the fact we had to talk about a real issue, and often that doesn't happen in the church. And so that, anyway.
In the Presbytery of Coastal Carolina, the big issue is not that one. The big issue is the marriage issue. And for a lot of that, it has to do with real poor communication. People don't understand that the gay marriage issue has to do with nothing any different than what we've always been. We clergy, we can decide who we're going to marry and where. The only thing is, the session gets to decide if it's going to be in that building or not, in that church or not. But we have had churches leave like crazy to the EOC, to the, you name it, every kind of place they can go under great duress, and people who probably won't ever come back into a church door because of the arguments. And yet some of the churches, the people who really have strong hopes for openness and diversity in the church, they are silent. And that's one of the things that George and I work really hard with congregations for, to get all the voices at the table so that we're not back and forth in each other, but really listening to one another deeply and beginning to understand. We don't have to agree with each other on everything, but listening deeply without judging what's right for me is not right for you or whatever is hugely important. And one of the things we're going to share with you today, a spiritual practice that we use often over and over again with congregations, we hope will give you a hint of how you might be able to get the voices open at the table as well.
So let's wrap up this conversation. As you look at this list and think about what we've been sharing together for the last 10 or 15 minutes, what's your impression right now about your congregation as you think about this list?
Can you explain what you just asked?
Yeah.
Because there's a dot here and a dot here, and I don't have anything in between.
Well, the question that was posed was, what's going on, what changes do you see in the world that affects your ministry context? And so the second question is, as you think about what we've discussed, what do you see going on in your congregation, or what do you think about your congregation at this point? And I saw a hand go up in the back.
In regard to the technology, even though we have several members who are not technologically savvy, I see our church moving forward. We have a new website. We're on Facebook and have a monthly newsletter. We're working very hard at communicating to our congregation what the session is doing. And
under the volunteer thing, the next generation of leaders, at this congregation, it's like 40 years old, and we've got people who are being leaders who have been here for umpty years, and we've brought in a lot of younger people of the next gen, like 40s type, 50s type people. What name is that? Is that the generation? Is that the millennials? Anyway, they are so busy raising children and doing their job and playing that it's hard for them to understand that there's good leadership training in the church when we train deacons and elders. And so, and to do it theologically, We're not teaching you to be the leader of the Red Cross. You know, you're being the ruling elders of the congregation. So I'm real concerned about that, because once they understand their responsibility and the ordination questions that they must answer, I think that is a big help to them understanding their call to, you know, be the good committee chairperson and, you know, that kind of stuff. It's leadership training because you've answered a call.
I just have to make my comment now so I can get it out of the way. I believe strongly in the wisdom and the gifts of congregations that are filled with older members. And I think we do a real injustice to the church by always saying our members are, you know, aged and can't do this or whatever. They are the ones who can give life to hurting families, to children who never get to see grandparents, who don't know what anything means. It's really a gift to us, and we as the Presbyterian Church need to get on board and to start celebrating the wisdom of those in our congregations, not always seeking the young adults who really need the wisdom and the gifts that to be, as George would say, pass the baton. You can't pass the baton if folks don't understand why. I mean, you can ask people to help, and you can do all you want to do, but unless their hearts are really open to it, and the stories, I mean, George and I are living in the stories. We are actually calling them testimonies of our older adults, and we now have a colleague who is videoing the good news stories that we're hearing throughout the Presbytery. And, you know, there's just something there. I mean, older adults have lived through some troubling times, and their faith has gotten them through in places that, you know, they could have never gotten through. And our younger adults need to hear that. You know, you don't have to go to a psychiatrist to get fixed. You can sit down with somebody and listen to them for a while and become partners with them and with their families. And I preach it, I mean it, and I hope that we as a denomination can get on board with that, not just passing people off because they no longer can do the new things. The technology scares people to death, and other things scare older adults to death. There are lots of physical and mental disabilities that they think they're no longer good for anything, and they are. And once we start sharing that wisdom in congregations, we may see more people begin to realize what it means to be part of a Presbyterian church that is connected in ways that you can't begin to understand. So, anyway,
but when we're talking about responding to change, when we are concerned and committed to vibrant congregations, there is no magic bullet. There is no secret plan or even guaranteed, you know, do this and do this and do this, and we can guarantee you that your church is going to be vibrant again. We are talking here about the difference between the difference that Ron Heifetz made in his book, Leadership Without Easy Answers, the difference between technical work and adaptive work. And what we are facing in our churches today is adaptive work. So what we want to do with you today in the amount of time we have with you is share with you 4 of the resources, tools, the processes that Beverly and I have assembled over the last 2 decades. Resources that we think are strong and productive, that require some level of learning, because what I used to say in the seminary classroom is, if you can't learn, you can't lead. We're going to share 4 of those with you today. The first one is a spiritual practice. that focuses on discernment through sharing voice. Both Beverly and I believe very strongly that one of the things that will help with adaptive work is for congregations to learn how to sit together and discern the leading of the Spirit through the voices, the collective voices of the congregation. This is not the same as saying, well, let's take a survey and do what's most popular. That's not what I'm talking about, and I can tell you lots of stories about why. Instead, we're talking about spiritual discernment through sharing voice. Another resource that we will introduce you to today, at least give you a feel for what it is and how it works and how you use it, we'll call, for these purposes, Discovering Deep Energy. In my graduate work and in my research as a teacher for the church, I have discovered some resources that, for lack of a better description, come out of the world of cultural anthropology, that when I began to read about them and think about how they could use them in the church, I felt like I was Martin Luther reading Romans. It was like scales were falling off my eyes, and I was saying to myself, so that's why that happens. So we will introduce you to a process that we call Discovering Deep Energy, and help you learn how to use it. A third thing that we're going to spend a little time on is kind of a way of organizing this conversation that we just had, but helping you learn how to make sense out of your context for ministry. And I call this confluence analysis, and I'm glad to be able to say to this group that I got the idea for it because I grew up here. And I think you'll understand what I mean once we get to that. The fourth and last thing that we're going to spend some time with is a topic that took me a number of years to get a handle on. When I first started doing this kind of work back in Chicago, I remember going to a church that asked me to come in and help them, and this was in the wake of the head of staff having left the year before, taking a big chunk of the congregation with him. This was not a Presbyterian church, by the way. And the associate pastor, who had just resigned like 3 months earlier, by standing up in worship, taking off a robe and throwing it on the floor, walking out of the sanctuary. And I remember saying to my contact person there, I don't do conflict. And what I meant by that is I haven't found a tool yet or a resource that helps me feel reasonably satisfied that we can make sense out of conflict. Well, now I do. And so the way we talk about this is resistance to change. So this afternoon we'll spend some time with you on showing you how, as you discover deep energy in your congregation, you will discover the sources not only of resistance to change, but opportunities for productive change. Resistance and opportunities. So these are 4 of the tools, processes that we use. And by giving you a chance to work with them a little bit today, we hope that this sparks some imagination in you in how to use this in your ministry context.